What if I told you that over 1 million African soldiers fought alongside Allied forces during World War II, yet their stories have been systematically erased from most history books? What if these forgotten heroes were not just present at some of the war's most decisive battles, but were actually instrumental in turning the tide against Nazi Germany? From the mountains of Italy to the beaches of southern France, from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Burma, African troops displayed extraordinary courage and skill that helped liberate Europe from fascist tyranny. Yet decades later, their sacrifices remain largely unknown, their valor unrecognized, and their contributions deliberately minimized by those who wrote the official histories. Today, we're finally telling the story that should have been told long ago, the story of the forgotten heroes who helped save the world from darkness, only to be denied their rightful place in history. The involvement of African troops in World War II was not accidental, but rather the result of colonial powers desperately needing manpower to fight a global war that stretched their resources to the breaking point. France, Britain, and other European nations controlled vast territories across Africa, and when war erupted in 1939, they immediately turned to their colonies for soldiers. What began as military necessity soon revealed something remarkable. African troops possessed exceptional fighting qualities that made them invaluable assets in the Allied war effort. The French recruited heavily from their West African colonies, particularly Senegal, Mali, and Burkina Faso, creating the famous tirailleurs sénégalais units that would become legendary for their fierce fighting spirit. The British drew from across their African territories, forming regiments from Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa that would serve with distinction in multiple theaters of war. These were not reluctant conscripts, but often volunteers who understood they were fighting against an ideology that viewed them as subhuman and would have enslaved or exterminated them if given the chance. The training and preparation of African troops revealed both the racism of the colonial system and the exceptional adaptability of the soldiers themselves. Many African recruits came from rural backgrounds with limited exposure to modern warfare technology, yet they quickly mastered complex military equipment and tactics that European soldiers took months to learn. French colonial officers were often amazed at how quickly Senegalese troops could strip and reassemble machine guns, operate radio equipment, and execute sophisticated battlefield maneuvers. British commanders in East Africa noted that Kenyan and Ghanaian soldiers displayed natural leadership abilities and tactical instincts that made them excellent non-commissioned officers. However, colonial prejudices meant that African soldiers were typically relegated to infantry roles and denied opportunities for advancement to senior positions, regardless of their abilities. They were also subjected to discriminatory policies regarding pay, equipment, and medical care that reflected the racist attitudes of the time. Despite these obstacles, African troops maintained remarkable morale and fighting effectiveness, driven by their own motivations for fighting fascism and their pride in proving their worth as soldiers. The first major test of African troops came during the North African campaign, where units like the French Senegalese tirailleurs and British West African forces played crucial roles in defeating German and Italian forces. In battles across Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, African soldiers demonstrated their combat effectiveness against some of Germany's most experienced desert fighters. The Senegalese troops were particularly noted for their aggressive fighting style and their ability to operate effectively in the harsh desert environment. During the Battle of Bir Hakeim in 1942, Free French forces that included significant numbers of African troops held off German attacks for over 2 weeks, inflicting heavy casualties and buying crucial time for British forces to regroup. African engineers and support troops proved equally valuable, building roads, airfields, and supply lines across the desert with remarkable speed and efficiency. Their knowledge of operating in extreme heat and harsh conditions gave Allied forces significant advantages over German troops who struggled with the African climate. When the North African campaign concluded with Allied victory in 1943, African troops had proven themselves as elite fighting forces capable of defeating the supposedly superior German military machine. The Italian campaign marked perhaps the finest hour for African troops in the European theatre, as they played decisive roles in some of the war's most brutal and strategically important battles. The French Expeditionary Corps, which included 4 divisions with substantial numbers of Moroccan, Algerian, and Senegalese troops, became one of the most effective fighting forces in Italy. During the Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944, when Allied forces had been stalled for months against seemingly impregnable German defences, it was Moroccan Goumier and Algerian tirailleurs who finally broke through the German lines. These North African mountain fighters used tactics learned in the Atlas Mountains to outflank German positions that had resisted frontal assaults for months. Their night raids and infiltration techniques terrorized German defenders who found themselves under attack from directions they thought impossible to approach. The breakthrough at Monte Cassino opened the road to Rome and marked a turning point in the Italian campaign. French colonial troops continued to distinguish themselves throughout the advance up the Italian peninsula, often spearheading the most dangerous assaults and consistently achieving objectives that other units had failed to capture. The liberation of southern France in August 1944 saw African troops literally liberating European soil from Nazi occupation. Yet this achievement has been systematically minimized in historical accounts. The French First Army, commanded by General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, was composed primarily of colonial troops from North and West Africa. When Operation Dragoon launched the invasion of southern France, it was Senegalese, Moroccan, and Algerian soldiers who stormed the beaches and fought their way inland against fierce German resistance. These African troops liberated major French cities, including Toulon, Marseille, and Lyon, often receiving enthusiastic welcomes from French civilians who had been under Nazi occupation for 4 years. The irony was profound. African soldiers from French colonies were liberating the French homeland from German occupiers. Yet when victory parades were organized and official photographs taken, African troops were often excluded or relegated to background positions to avoid challenging racial sensibilities. General Charles de Gaulle himself ordered that African troops be replaced by white French forces for the liberation of Paris, despite the fact that colonial troops had done much of the fighting to make that liberation possible. Beyond Europe, African troops served with equal distinction in the Burma campaign, where they faced some of the most challenging fighting conditions of the entire war. The King's African Rifles, drawn from British East African territories, played crucial roles in the reconquest of Burma from Japanese forces. These troops proved exceptionally well adapted to jungle warfare, using skills developed in African environments to outmaneuver and defeat Japanese forces who had previously dominated jungle fighting. Nigerian, Ghanaian, and Kenyan soldiers served alongside British and Indian forces in the famous Chindit operations, conducting long-range penetration missions behind Japanese lines that disrupted enemy supply lines and communications. Their ability to operate for weeks in hostile territory with minimal supplies impressed even veteran British commanders who had initially doubted their capabilities. During the Battle of Kohima and Imphal, African troops helped stop the Japanese invasion of India, fighting with such tenacity that Japanese commanders reported they had never faced more determined opponents. The success of African troops in Burma demonstrated their versatility and effectiveness across completely different environments and against different enemies, proving that their military excellence was not limited to any single theatre or type of warfare. The systematic erasure of African contributions from World War II history began almost immediately after the war ended, driven by colonial powers' desire to maintain racial hierarchies and avoid acknowledging the full extent of African military capabilities. French authorities deliberately minimized references to colonial troops in official histories, focusing instead on the Free French forces and the resistance movement. British accounts similarly downplayed African contributions, emphasizing the roles of British, Canadian, and Australian forces while treating African participation as a footnote. American histories, influenced by their own racial prejudices, largely ignored African troops entirely, despite the fact that these forces had been crucial allies in achieving victory. This historical amnesia was not accidental, but reflected deliberate policies designed to preserve colonial authority and racial supremacy in the post-war world. Colonial governments feared that acknowledging African military prowess might encourage independence movements and challenge the fundamental assumptions of colonial rule. The result was a massive distortion of historical truth that robbed African veterans of recognition and denied future generations knowledge of their ancestors' heroic contributions to defeating fascism. The human cost paid by African troops was enormous, yet their sacrifices have received little recognition or commemoration. Casualty rates among colonial forces were often higher than those of European troops, partly because they were frequently assigned to the most dangerous missions, and partly because they received inferior medical care and equipment. Thousands of African soldiers died in Italian mountains, French beaches, and Burmese jungles, fighting for ideals of freedom and democracy that their own colonial rulers denied them at home. Many survivors returned to Africa only to face continued discrimination and denial of veterans' benefits that were routinely provided to white soldiers. Some African veterans who had fought to liberate Europe found themselves imprisoned or killed when they later fought for their own country's independence from colonial rule. The French government's treatment of Senegalese veterans was particularly shameful, as many were denied pensions and benefits for decades after the war ended. It was not until the 21st century that some European governments began to acknowledge their debts to African veterans and provide long overdue recognition and compensation. Recent historical research has begun to restore African troops to their rightful place in World War II history, revealing the full extent of their contributions and the injustices they suffered. Scholars have documented how African soldiers' tactical innovations, cultural knowledge, and fighting skills were often crucial to Allied success in key battles. New evidence shows that colonial troops frequently outperformed European units in combat effectiveness, leadership, and adaptability to challenging conditions. The courage and sacrifice of these forgotten heroes challenges fundamental assumptions about military history and forces us to reconsider our understanding of who really won World War II. Their story is not just about military achievement, but about human dignity, courage in the face of prejudice, and the universal desire for freedom and recognition. As we finally begin to tell their stories properly, we honor not just their memory, but the truth itself, ensuring that future generations understand the full complexity and diversity of the struggle against fascism. The legacy of African troops in World War II extends far beyond their military achievements to encompass broader questions about justice, recognition, and historical truth. These forgotten heroes fought not just against Nazi Germany, but against the racist ideologies that sought to deny their humanity and capabilities. Their courage on battlefields from Italy to Burma proved that heroism knows no racial boundaries, and that the fight for freedom belongs to all humanity. As we remember their sacrifices and celebrate their achievements, We also acknowledge the ongoing struggle to ensure that all voices are heard in the telling of history. The story of African troops in World War II reminds us that the past is not fixed, but constantly being rediscovered and reinterpreted as we strive for a more complete and honest understanding of our shared human experience. If this incredible story of forgotten heroes moved you as much as it moved us, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below about these remarkable soldiers who helped save the world. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered. There are so many more incredible tales of courage and sacrifice waiting to be discovered, and we're committed to bringing them to light for audiences who appreciate the full complexity and diversity of our past.